Hello, and welcome to this introduction to humanistic psychology. In this tutorial, you will learn about the main ideas of Rogers and Abraham Maslow, the founders of this branch of psychology. And as you can see by the title, it is called the third force because Freud's ideas of the psyche, or psychoanalysis, was the first important force, and after him came Watson and Skinner's ideas of behaviorism as the second force. So Maslow and Rogers' ideas of humanism or humanistic psychology that started in the mid-60s or the early 60s is considered the third force. Humanistic psychology was as radically different in its day, so in the 60s, as Freud's ideas were in his day. Maslow and Rogers' perspectives take a very different view of human personality. They see personality as guided by each person's experience and values. Humanistic psychology stresses the positive side of human nature, and as you know, that this is not at all what Freud stressed. Humanistic psychology sees the values and the desire in a human being to be healthy and to grow to be the best person that they can be. Humanistic psychology is not interested in the unconscious mind, but instead in the desire of each person to grow and to achieve self-actualization. We each have a unique desire to fulfill our own potential. This perspective emphasizes the positive side of people, our freedom, and our desire to be better, to be bigger, to be more tomorrow than we are today. And these are the ideas of humanistic psychology that we will explore with Maslow and Rogers. The growth perspective of Freud was very different from the growth perspective of Maslow and Rogers. As you can probably remember, for Freud, the idea of growth was pretty much people going through the psychosexual stages of development. So the oral stage and the anal stage and the phallic stage and all the stages that you studied. So remember that Freud's idea of the personality is based on his theory of the psyche and the forces that lay hidden there, namely the id and the superego. Remember that Freud believed that people were largely motivated by these unconscious forces. And remember also in the documentary The Century of the Self, you saw that Freud's view of human nature was pretty negative. People were, he believed, irrational, animal-like, and downright untrustworthy. Certainly not capable of running a democracy and doing something as reasonable as voting. Growth was a process of resolving these neurotic conflicts as far as Freud was concerned. But in humanism or humanistic psychology, people are motivated by growth and health. So Rogers and Maslow's starting point in their clinical work was with their patients, and that's how they developed their ideas, just as Freud did, but instead they started with a belief in the positive potential in people. So Rogers has an idea or a theory of the self, and pretty much that is people's innate, so in other words, if it's innate, you have it, you're born with it, you don't have to learn it, it comes naturally. So people's innate desire for growth. So according to Rogers, the self is something that emerges as the individual has experiences with the world. So the term self describes you and your personality. So as we live and have all these experiences, we form opinions about our abilities. So the self is the overall perception of our abilities as we have perceived it through time. And this is what he calls the self-concept. But there is another part of our personality. Rogers introduces the idea of what he calls the real self. And the real self is what a person is capable of becoming if they lived in an ideal world. Imagine that you can have any opportunity that you desire, seriously, any at all. Imagine that everyone who knows you values and cherishes you unconditionally, even when you make dumb mistakes and you disappoint them. This is what Rogers meant by an ideal world. So this ideal world is the environment of what he called unconditional positive regard. And I'll explain that in a second, but pretty much it's I love you no matter what you do. So such individuals who grow up in this ideal world would be psychologically healthy and have a positive, unconditional self-regard. Unfortunately, such environments are pretty rare, and as a result of this scarcity, people develop what Rogers called conditions of worth, and I'll explain that in a second. So from the real self, now we go to the ideal self. So if money were no object and you could get into any college, any university, or have any opportunity you wanted, meet whoever you wanted, what type of person would you want to be? What would you want to do with your life? What kind of career would you want to have? This ideal self that we're describing here, so from your own desires, is not only shaped by what you would want for yourself, but it's also largely shaped by what other people want from you and what their idea of worth and your worth is. So let me explain. Everyone wants to be accepted and valued by other people. That's just human nature and a human need, according to Maslow. We all act in certain ways so that we can be acceptable to others. So our self-concept describes how we see ourselves, but the ideal self describes the person that we wish we were, or the person that we wish we could be. If these two are similar, so the real self and the ideal self, then we're probably a pretty happy person. The self-actualized person is one whose self-concept and the ideal self have greater similarities than differences. If the way you see your life is very different from how you would like to be, you may become depressed, angry, or anxious. But no one is perfect, so what to do? Rogers says that as long as the person is taking steps towards becoming the ideal self, they will feel more hopeful in everything that they do, and everything that they do will be one step closer to the ideal self. This brings us closer to mental health and happiness. So this process of becoming your ideal self, Rogers calls self-actualization, or making the ideal self real, because to actualize means to make something real. And so on the left, you see the self-image or the self-concept, how you see yourself. And on the right, you see how you see yourself with the ideal self. And you see that in this Venn diagram here on the left, there's less in common than on the right. And so there's going to be more incongruity on the left and less on the right. This was Rogers' idea of how people developed neuroses. It was pretty different from Freud's. So remember, Freud's idea of a neuroses was when the ego couldn't balance what the id and the superego were both screaming at it from either ear. But in Rogers' case, the neuroses comes from when how we see ourselves is greatly removed from the person that we would like to be. So that is where the neuroses would develop as far as Rogers is concerned. So Rogers also has this idea of organismic valuing. His entire theory is actually built on this idea of actualizing tendency or organismic valuing that he calls a force of life. It can be defined as a built-in motivation present in absolutely every life form to evolve, to develop its potentials to its fullest possible extent. So we're not just talking about survival here. Rogers believed that all creatures strive to make the very best of their existence, and if they fail to do so, it's not for lack of desire. So he speaks of something he calls organismic valuing, or pretty much liking what we need and liking what is good for us. So if people trust their instincts, they will consume and eat and behave in ways that contribute to their well-being. That's the idea of the broccoli floweret. So this makes sense in the context of evolutionary biology because we know human beings evolved to favor colors because they helped us recognize the difference between ripe and unripe and what's good to eat and what's bad to eat. But if you think of the organismic valuing and the actualizing tendency in terms of yourself, in terms of who you know yourself to be and what you know is really good for you versus what other people might say is good for you and what other people might want from you. And you'll see this idea develops a little bit later on. So what are the kinds of things that we like? Well, we like what we need. We value love, affection, acceptance, and other things that Rogers called positive regard from others. To regard something is to look at it, and to regard it positively means to have a positive opinion about that thing. But we also need this from ourselves, a natural valuing of self that he called positive self-regard. This makes total sense because without it, we would hate ourselves and we would be unhappy and would not want to grow. No one wants to feel impotent, small, and useless. We need to feel both positive regard from others and positive regard from the self to actualize our full potential, or self-actualize, as Rogers would say. But there is no utopia, and everywhere we turn, our worth feels as if it is being measured by someone or something. Rogers calls this conditions of worth. There are certain conditions of worth put down by the society, and those are norms that must be followed if the individual is going to get any love and affection or respect. You can think of this as a social conditioning. Our society also might lead us astray with these conditions of worth. As we grow up, our parents, teachers, peers, media, and others only give us what not only give us what we need when we show that we are worthy, rather than just because we need it. So if we get a drink when we finish our class, we get something sweet when we finish our vegetables, most importantly, we get love and affection if and only if we behave. These are the conditions of worth. So getting positive regard on condition, Roger calls conditional positive regard. Because we do indeed need positive regard, these conditions are very powerful, and we bend ourselves into a shape determined not by our organismic valuing, in other words, what we know is good for us, but by a society that may or may not have our best interests at heart. Over time, this conditioning leads us to have conditional positive self-regard as well. We begin to like ourselves only if we meet up with the standards others have applied to us, rather than if we actualize our own potential and meet our own standards. And since these societal standards or these conditions of worth were created without keeping each individual in mind, more often than not, we find ourselves unable to meet them and therefore, sadly, unable to maintain any self-esteem. Remember, positive regard is almost always conditional, meaning that rules apply. And remember that this need for positive regard is so powerful that we will bend and shape our natural personality and selves in order to have this conditional positive regard. Sometimes it warps what we really are and we become alienated from ourselves. In other words, we do things that are harmful to us and not what we naturally want or what we know is good for us, just so we can have the positive regard from others. We internalize this, and over time, this becomes conditional positive regard. So take a moment and look at this chart. On the left, you see the process of becoming the real self, and on the right, you see the process of becoming the ideal self. The idea is to have the real self and the ideal self as close to each other as possible. The further the distance, the greater the incongruence, or the greater the neuroses. So you can pause the video and take a look at this slide. In order to be free of this tyranny, Rogers said that we must give one another unconditional positive regard, to accept and value each other regardless of our behavior. This would elevate self-worth and help people move towards self-actualization. So again, pause the video and reflect on these questions. Is it possible that we can be friends with all people regardless of their behavior? I don't think that's what he really meant. But what do you think? Do you think it's possible to have unconditional positive regard for others? Pause the video and reflect on this for a moment. So Abraham Maslow is the second person in humanistic psychology that we're going to look at today. Unfortunately, Maslow had a really dismal childhood. His father was a terrible alcoholic who was aloof and dismissive of Abraham. His mother was abusive to him, and she was a terrible Scrooge and a miser. She used to put a lock on the fridge door to make sure that the children didn't eat. They were not poor, but they didn't have a lot. His parents were Russian immigrants, and his father had enough money for them to live, but they didn't live in any great wealth. One day, Maslow found these stray kittens and brought them home, and he hid them in a basement and gave them milk. And when his mother found them, she was infuriated, and she killed them in front of him by smashing their heads against the wall. This horrific act of barbarity so deeply affected him that he openly expressed his hostility towards his mother his entire life, calling her a hateful person. You could say that Maslow's relationship with his mother was about as far away as you can get from Freud's Oedipal complex. And we can also appreciate that he grew up in very difficult and unloving circumstances. In his autobiography, Maslow writes about how he felt ugly and unloved. He called himself the ugliest of the ugly. So when he became a psychologist, he studied the lives of people who were greatly loved and accomplished, the lives of great leaders. And as he studied them, he found that they had much in common, as you see here. And here. And again here. So Maslow drew up what he called a portrait of a self-actualized person. After studying these great and accomplished people, he decided to shape his life according to these characteristics that he believed were essential to becoming self-actualized. For Maslow, becoming all that you can be, or self-actualized, was not only the highest good, but it was the greatest need. He believed that every single person on the planet shared these needs. You can pause the video for a moment and reflect on any one of these characteristics. Which ones do you think you already have? And which ones do you see yourselves as still working on? So Maslow models his life after these people and these characteristics of the great leaders. And this is where he develops his hierarchy of needs. He believed, as I said, that people have many needs, and the greatest of them is self-actualization, or the fulfillment of human potential. So he puts these needs in a hierarchy because Maslow believed that we had to meet the basic levels before we could go on to meet the other levels. And here on the slide you see that you have the physiological and the safety at the bottom. In other words, we need to fulfill our basic physical needs for survival before we can go ahead and fulfill and think about even fulfilling our other needs. So safety and security are also physical, but in a sense, they're also psychological. We need to feel safe both physically and psychologically. In the middle, we have love and belonging. Everyone needs intimate relationships, but we also need to belong to something bigger than ourselves, whether it be a job, a group, an association, a nation, a church, a temple, a synagogue. We have an emotional need to belong to something that is larger than who we are. And then above that, self-esteem. We all want to be recognized for our uniqueness, and Maslow believed that we moved frequently back and forth between the need for self-esteem and the need for belonging. In other words, when our need for belonging and love was fulfilled, then we could focus on self-esteem. But when that was not the case, that we had to go back to fulfill our basic needs. So then above the self-esteem is the self-actualization, or achieving your potential. Maslow says that many people have what he called a deficiency orientation in their personality, and they focused on their unmet needs, or rather on what they didn't have. He believed this to be counterproductive. Even though he believed that not very many people actually achieved self-actualization, he did believe that if we had a growth orientation, then we could focus on what we can do instead of what we can't do, and be better able to fulfill our full potential. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this Canadian who you should know and you probably don't know. His name is Rick Hansen, and he accomplished some absolutely amazing things. In 1973, he was in a car accident and became paralyzed as a result, but he really was very athletic, and his urge to remain active sent him off for rehabilitation, sent him off to the University of British Columbia, where he was the first person to graduate with a degree in physical education in 1976, only 3 years after his accident. I mean, he never stopped. He met Terry Fox in 1976, and they became good friends. From 1979 to 1984, he won 19 international wheelchair marathons, 9 gold medals at Pan Am Wheelchair Games. He was Canada's Disabled Athlete for the years 1979, 1980, 1982, and most amazingly of all, in 1985, he begins the Man in Motion tour around the world, completing the equivalent of 3 marathons every day. It took him through 34 countries, and he raised $26 million for spinal cord research. So here's an example of how when we lose things, that doesn't mean that we have to stop growing. We focus on what we can do instead of what we can't do. We all lose things sometimes. But when we accept the reality of our situation and we really want to grow, then that's when we can move into growth.
szerokiej drogi bardzo. Every time we reach an obstacle, we believe with all our heart that somehow, some way, there's a way over it, under it, around it, or through it. I even believe that one day the wheelchair will be something you'll see in a museum.
So I think Rick Hansen is a perfect example of what Maslow would call a self-actualized person. So in summary, Rogers would say that our natural state, human beings' natural state, is a good state. We naturally want to pay attention to the true self to be and grow towards that.